This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we discuss satisfying character endings, the complexity in expectations, and relinquishing control for greater storytelling. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop scenarios and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And today we have a very interesting topic to take a look at. Take it away, John.
All right. So yeah, I wanted to follow up actually from episode 86, which part of that episode was the framing of death. And during that episode, one of the things that Adam brought up is the question of what becomes possible when your character dies. And I've listened back to that episode a few times. I felt like we had valuable discussion. We left it off with, there's more of this to talk about. But and we had a good start to kind of exploring it, but apparently it took 30 episodes for a lot of that to sink in. So it was more just I finally realized about a week ago, listening to another podcast, Adventuring Academy by Brennan Lee Mulligan, who is an excellent dungeon master. He has his podcast is all about helping new DMs kind of get started while interviewing other, major hitters in the industry, like Matthew Mercer, Marisha Ray, and Satine Phoenix, so a whole lot of awesome personalities. And what it did is it started realizing the reason why I wasn't able to really give a lot of cohesive arguments against the idea of like what becomes possible when a character dies. Like we seem to set up this dynamic, right? Where like some players are energized by it, some players are bummed out by it. Oh, what do you do with that, right? So, and I realized the thing that wasn't set up was the expectations at the table, right? So we were in a conversational space where we never questioned the core assumption, right? Which is, what is the table's relationship with PC death, And, because we were trying to come up with, like, examples and, just, like, anecdotal evidence, and it wasn't, like, well organized in terms of, like, the thoughts, right? So, and I really do think that's worth a conversation, ideally at a session 0, but even mid-campaign, which is just, what is our table's relationship with PC death, So, because I do know, like, Adam has brought up examples of, like, players that don't really care if their characters die. It's just, they're dead. Bob 1 has died. Bob 2 is coming back, So, and they don't really care. That also means that character's death wasn't meaningful, which means PC death for that table isn't meaningful, right? That's going to have a very different emotional impact and a very different gameplay impact, right? Based on, say, a different campaign where I remember in Grey Owls, we had a player that said, if my character dies, I will not play anymore. I will come and I will watch, but I will not play. And that's because their character was so meaningful to them that they couldn't possibly replace it, even if that character died at like session 3, So, and that is a different emotional thing to navigate, to be sensitive about. That is not something that we meet with excitement, because that's grief, I want you to imagine that someone that's close to you died. You're not going to be like, well, what becomes possible? Like, at the same time, though, if there's like a thing where, let's say the player sees an emotional arc for their character. I mean, this has happened countless times with retiring a character, right? That question becomes so much more energizing because the player has let go already, you know, and they may not have even grieved. It's just, it's time that this character's story is finished. So that's definitely an awesome thing when, like, let's say it's like, you know, my character is finally facing the rival that they've tracked down for the past 12 sessions, and they have a duel to the death. And it's like the end of Cowboy Bebop, spoiler alert, where they just stab each other dramatically, and then this character dies. Now what becomes possible narratively about that, the fallout of that character? So that question is still appropriate. The frame of where it's at, which of course this is a response to the framing of death, that can change the entire conversation and kind of change the feel of it. So, you know, one of the things that I prefer is that with PC death, and I'm stealing this from Brennan Lee Mulligan, so you should go watch that podcast. But is that PC death, like, ideally is poetic and meaningful. That you don't have a PC death because a goblin rolled a nat 20 on an arrow attack and it just happens out of the blue, you know? So with that understanding, you know, you also want, like, combat to matter. You want stakes to matter, right? Now, again, if you're playing with a bunch of teenagers and they don't care if their PC dies, well, now it doesn't matter if there's, like, a sudden PC death or anything like that. But a lot of times I think, especially where I was getting caught emotionally in that other episode, 30 episodes ago, was the idea that if your PC dies suddenly, that you should be excited about that. Or that, you know, somehow you should just kind of suck it up because that's part of the game. And that's the part that that I think warrants a very real discussion. So the other possibility, of course, is that we just have an alternative metric for failure, you know? So not every conflict or every encounter has to be a fight to the death. Sometimes, let's say, you know, I just played this in another game where the real goal of the fight isn't to just slaughter all the goblins. The goal of the fight is to non-lethally damage them so that we can interrogate them and figure out the truth about what's going on, you know? That now if the goblins die, now that's a failure, you know? The PCs aren't worried about dying in that encounter, but there is a separate win and loss condition that's set up. Or the flip side, where, you know, the town is being attacked by giants. You don't want the townspeople to die. So how successful you are is measured by how many townspeople you can save, you know? That's not PC death, you know? That's not, death doesn't always have to be on the table. Maybe an encounter is about more, it's a conflict of morale, right? Or maybe it's being able to win a duel, you know? Like Tyranny of Dragons starts like that, where one of the first encounters is there's a duel with one of the half dragons, you know? And if he defeats the adventurer, he doesn't kill them, right? That's a different, like, that's a different conflict than a super deadly encounter with a dragon every time, you know? But I think the biggest thing is that, and this was the point that I thought was really profound, is that the way our brain processes imaginary characters like PCs and NPCs that we interact with is largely the same function as real people, you know? So like the ocular part of the brain, when we intensely visualize something, it gets interpreted nearly the same as when we actually see something. So a lot of times our memories of, say, slaying a dragon, as long as we're really immersed, that memory can be just as real as remembering to go to Costco yesterday, you know? So, and of course, like, Ian, if you have any like counter or more or elaborated explanation of all that science, you know, feel free. But the idea being that a lot of times the imaginary characters that don't exist feel real to us. So when they die, we go through real grief. And I just felt like the conversation in 86 was getting to the point where it was more like there wasn't time to grieve. And I think that, again, when death is really sudden in a D&D game, because there's revivifies and resurrections, a lot of times denial is the stage we get stuck in when it comes to grief. And I know grieving is more complicated. It's been proven to be more complicated than just the 5 simple steps. But like the idea being that a lot of times, like, I can just get resurrected, right? I can just get reincarnated, right? Because that's part of the game. That's the magic. And when is it, and that's a more real conversation to have. When is it time to go on a quest to revive the fallen hero? And when is it time to let that hero go? And I think ultimately, this is more stand-bying my advice or explanation or whatever you want to call it for when we first did this, which is each character is valued differently based on the player that is portraying them. So you don't have a blanket rule of your character died suddenly, we'll just suck it up. Like, if a character dies, to me, I don't care if you're planning like a 4-hour session. If they die in hour 1, that's time for a break and time for a conversation. Everybody else go get snacks. We need to really sit down and determine where you're at with it and give them time, because like there's one thing where they're, oh, I'm fine with it. And then all of a sudden they're like passive aggressive to you for the next 3 hours because they haven't necessarily, it hasn't sunken in yet, you know? So there's this, like you almost, especially if there's a lot of sudden spike damage, you want to get the play. It's basically like that player just experienced death. You want to give them time to disassociate and grieve. I think that was Satine Phoenix that said that on Brennan Lee Mulligan's podcast. I could be wrong. Could have been Erica Aisha, if I said that right. Ooh, I'm bad with names. But yeah, I've got one more note, but I'm gonna pass it off to whoever wants to talk next.
Erica Ishii.
There it is.
Erica Ishii. When we talk about the very realness, just the realness of immersion, how that can ping in the same memory as what we would then refer to as real life experience. This is why positive affirmation therapy can be so effective. There are people that are full of garbage in that realm, but then there are people that use it effectively. And it's the idea of immersing yourself into a mindset that then has the same psychological and neurological response as something that actually happened. And it doesn't have to necessarily feel quote unquote real, but it will it'll still have the same responses, the physiological responses. And then if you have memories of fighting a dragon and being courageous, then actually using that to pull from to when you need to feel courageous. But there's a lot of psychological elements to that. And again, D&D is not therapy. D&D can be therapeutic, but that sort of connection is another reason why death can be so visceral for some people, because they're so immersed. This is their character. This is not like just their avatar in a video game. This is a part of them. And when a PC makes a character, often they give a part of themselves to make them. So when they die, it's a harder hit, whether we recognize it or not. So that conversation is immensely valuable.
And it came back to, I was listening to Brennan Lee Mulligan talk about Call of Cthulhu, which was another game system that we had discussed earlier. And it was an interesting one because, you know, Adam, you were like, this is a really narrative game, but you're expected that your PC is going to die, you know? And like Ian and I, what we were saying is that sounds like you wouldn't get as invested in your character. And like what Brennan Lee Mulligan said was what Ian and I said. Having played the system, he always felt like because you had to assume that your character was going to be corrupted or killed, that almost like universally, everyone was playing more jokey characters, that they were playing something sillier, which now is less immersive and might be less meaningful ultimately. And I'm not saying Call of Cthulhu is like that. I'm just saying that a lot of times the system is going to encourage certain patterns of character creation, right? If you know that you're going into a dungeon crawl, you are going to build a different character than knowing you're running a political intrigue game. Or if you're running, something like a survival horror, like Icewind Dale, where you're just trying to survive against the elements. Those are all going to be very different characters. So, one of the things that I told Ian while we were talking about this was, what would it look like instead for Call of Cthulhu? Instead of assuming that your player character is going to die, you start with the table by saying, one of you is going to be dead by the end of this, but most of you might live. The key to making death meaningful is to give them hope that their character will live, right? Because now death is the absence of life. So by giving them the hope that their character might make it through, that makes it all the more meaningful when a character dies, right? And a lot of times, again, I'm not really one for fudging rules. I think that a lot of times, there's times for PC death. One of the things I recently said for my latest campaign is, we have all these resurrect spells in 5th edition. They also all require diamonds. And in this world, there are almost no diamonds. So you can instead choose to roll for Revivify without needing the material, basically shortcutting the material component, but now it's not going to be as consistently effective. So if a character goes down, that's a lot worse than just, I've got 13 diamonds on me that are each worth 300 gold pieces. Boom. And also, I never thought it was also fair to require a roll if you went out of your way to get the material components. Because now what's the point of casting? You know what I mean? It's like an extra layer of, rather than creating 2 decisions, now it's like, I just made this a weaker option, So, and that now becomes a thing. So to me, again, the key to making death meaningful isn't in the gameplay mechanics, any adjustment to that, right? So I don't basically if a PC dies and gets revived, I'm at liberty as a dungeon master to do something like raise the death save DC, but I tend not to. And the reason for that is because I think that if death isn't meaningful narratively alone, then there's an issue with the construction of the narrative. And that's kind of where I'm at with it. And again, I think that the key to making death meaningful is the hope that your character will live. And a lot of times, we've had it where a PC dies and we've honored them. We've actually taken a session or part of a session to have a funeral or have a service, that the more you can establish that, the more powerful the stories you're going to tell are.
A lot has transpired in the games that we are running since episode 86. And I was jotting down examples of how things have changed or how I've presented games and sessions since that episode. And it brings to mind a conversation first with Dark Owls that in their session 0 that I talked about how PC death was possible. And because you're in hell, it's very possible some of you have died before. And that death isn't necessarily the end, that there are creatures that might be fighting for your soul. And maybe dying presents another narrative opportunity to be connected to another thing that says, I want you to live, and this is why, and this is the thing. And there's a story there. And then by presenting that, we had some players reach out to me privately and say, I think I have died before, and I think that's why I'm in hell, and this is why I do this. And I think that I'm paying off a debt to this other extraplanar creature, and actually what I want to do is get strong enough that I can destroy that extraplanar creature and free myself from that debt. And there's a story there. So right at the beginning in our session 0, presenting the idea that you might die, and if you do, that may not be the end, that there might be something else that's going to transpire. that presentation for that setting and where we are and what, like, the tone of that campaign felt very appropriate to present that, because you're in hell. And that seemed to be energizing for that group, because PC death is possible, but it isn't the end. And that's very important to recognize. But as we started to move through this, very, very recently in Shadowfell, one of the players at the end of the session, they were so concerned that, oh my gosh, I'm going to get possessed, or my character's going to die, or I'm going to lose control of them. And it is always okay, absolutely always okay, to step out of the game and reassure a player, because it serves me in no way to have them stressing out about, oh my god, my character's gonna die. And it's so much better for me to say, dude, you're not dead, you're not possessed. This might be a problem that you need to get to later, but this isn't what's happening. So you don't have to think like that. You don't have to go into that hopeless space. This is worrisome, but it is not that. So you don't have to go crazy about it. And in doing that and having to, and like stepping out of the game, that's happened a couple times in a game. You have people who are very invested in their characters. They will get so concerned about, oh no, I missed that one saving throw. What did that mean? And now I'm just gone now. And it's okay to step outside of the game to reassure them and let them know that isn't what's happening. There might be something wrong, but that's not the road that has now set things in motion. We're not like now steamrolling to the character's death. It is, something's up, maybe deal with it, but it's not that. And that can be really good. So reassuring your players is immensely powerful. And I think of all the times that in the variability of the game that a character's death has happened, and how we as the DM have an opportunity, especially like early game, like level 2, 3, 4, where just, oh my gosh, it happens. Oops. I remember working with Archer, one of our other DM buddies, rolled like double damage in Pathfinder and killed a PC. Boom, just down. And so they panicked. And then I panicked because I was in the room, and we're both watching the player, and they very skillfully did a very awesome thing that they brought them back in a very organic and story-driven way, and that person was brought back like someone in their unconsciousness grabbed them by the arm and then pulled them back to the land of the living. And now they have a mark of like a ghostly hand on their arm. As a story, that campaign ended kind of early, but Archer had planned for there to be something there if the player wanted to explore it, or just wear that mark proudly. And that meant it also opened the door if the player wanted to move through there. Then they could, or they could just leave it and be like, this was that time that I brushed with death. It doesn't have to be this sudden variable death. And I think that's also a thing with the game's legacy that may contribute to a lot of those difficult feelings at the table where you have weird clashes and passive aggressive clashes with the DM or with the other players or the monsters. Although if they were aggressive to the monsters, that's probably better. But it's the misinterpretation of that rapport and relationship when a sudden death happens and we don't handle it well. So I completely agree with you, John, that you should, if 4-hour session, if you're a little bit of time in and someone dies, that you should take a break and kind of figure out how does this proceed, because that also lends a great relationship, a good rapport between the DM and the player. It creates space, and it can be a delicate thing. And when you just steamroll over it, it doesn't also honor the feelings of that player, which is ruinous to that relationship. When you think about it, the relationship at the table, I guess that's my win condition. If the relationship at the table remains solid, then a lot of crazy things can happen. But if the DM and the players are on excellent terms, then the other stuff doesn't matter because you've maintained a good game.
Well, and not only maintained, but every time this happens, it's an investment in trust. And to me, PC death is the ultimate test of the trust that you've invested at the table. So I like what you said, Adam, and just to kind of codify it a little, I think the real like the end realization is that your players, like, part of that trust is giving them that that control over their character's story. So even if the dice work against them, let's say like you get like a nat 20 on them, and out of nowhere, you deal 20 damage to the wizard with 14 hit points and they die, you break the game, or you take a break, break the game, and you pull them to the side and you just have a conversation of like, all right, so how can we work together to have this be satisfying and meaningful, right? Is the most meaningful way for you right now to let go of this character for the time being, right? Is this a thing where we're going to finish where we're at, the characters are going to run away, you get to build a new character, and they meet you in town, Is this a thing where I can offer you, say, like you said, Adam, like what Archer did, offer a deal or a pact with an extra planar entity, which now adds an additional complication to the story. I mean, we joke about it, but if you think back to like Supernatural, like the Winchester brothers died like 15 times each, but every time they did, there was an additional complication. And they even talked about that later on, where it's like, well, this time I died and I went to hell and became a worse person. And then I was lifted from perdition by Castiel the angel. And then this time I died, but I died really so I could go talk to the Reapers and understand how death works in this world. And, so that was the thing, is that the stakes are real, but again, now this is an alternative loss condition. The death was meaningful because now I have to deal with this devil that brought me back to life with the soul. Or having that complication in life isn't worth it, and you can even offer them you can give them the comfort of a peaceful rest. So it's like your character died very suddenly. It was very awful. We didn't like it. But they go to the fields of Elysium. You as a player can rest assured that your character's soul is at rest and at peace, if you would like them to be, or it might even be something like, this happened in Grey Owls, where a PC death led to that soul being embedded in a magic item. So now that PC is actually still part of the game. They're still part of the story. It's just that the function that they play is a little different. That now there's a quest of, I need to get a new body, I'm like part of your magic sword, like, so maybe we have to go find a cauldron of rebirth. So, or something like that. So you can make a quest out of it, like there's so many like creative ways beyond just suck it up, that I think can be explored. And it again, it's not, there's a difference between that and plot armor. Plot armor means, as the DM, I don't want you to die, so I'm not going to actually roll dice to damage you. Death being a potential complication because you've made an extra planar deal that you now have to navigate. That now is narratively enriching, So, and I think that really PC death ends up being that one-on-one conversation with each player, because each of us processes grief in a very different, visceral way, and how much we like our characters. Like if Solomon died, that would be devastating, right? Because it's like a very good old friend passing away suddenly. So, and it's kind of, I had mentioned this outside of the recording, but it's kind of like if you have a pet, there's a difference between you going to the vet and euthanizing them versus them like getting hit by a car, you know, how you process those two kinds of traumas are very, very different, and also unique to each person. So you almost, as the DM, when you're dealing with this, you want to your goal is to listen. Your goal is to ask the players non-judgmental questions, get a read on what on their responses, and really be able to shape the story so it's satisfying for everybody, but also comforting that player because they're going through very real grief.
So we've been talking about like this idea of like the DM sparing characters and stuff like that in some cases, or like the characters themselves creating story-driven ways to resurrect the fallen ally, either through magic or through prayer, or creating new pacts and things like that. And it just brings to mind this idea of the ex machina, which is something that I try to avoid whenever possible in my games. And I just want, for any DMs out there listening and wondering, like, oh, Mike, I just had a player character die. Should I just bring them back, like, out of nowhere? And it's like, yes and no, maybe. Like, it's like we've been saying, you should talk to your players about it and how they feel about that character's death before anything else. But it just all this talk reminded me of this time that I was playing Mu, which is my Warforged Fey Wanderer. And this was the first time that I had played him, and it was the first encounter of the whole campaign. And we had, like, sure, there was like stuff that was set up technically around us, but like there was nothing that was like concrete about like what happens if you die, because we didn't expect to die in the first encounter. And so with my character, being a Warforged and stuff, we were like, okay, Mu's dead, like straight up, because he got crit on and all sorts of things, and that did more HP than he had maximum HP. So what do we do about that? And so I said to John, I'm looking for an ex machina, honestly. Like, this is the first session of the campaign. And I remember spending so much time on this character, talking to John about the character too. And I was like, I was really excited to see this character, keep going. But like, this is the first session's combat and he's dead. Can you help me out? And so like we, canonically we came up with some other excuses and stuff, but at the time I considered it an ex machina because it came from literally outside the system, like outside the pre-established system. So my question becomes then, is it ever okay to use an ex machina, like okay, quote unquote, morally, is it morally dubious to use an ex machina, or is it okay sometimes when the dice just work against you in the worst possible way and there's nothing pre-established to save you? Like story driven resurrections are great and all, but like sometimes it's not in the cards, so to speak. So that's one of my questions, really.
So a Deus Ex Machina is really what we're referencing here, and we sometimes just shorten it to Ex Machina. But a Deus Ex Machina is an unexpected power or event that saves a hopeless situation. It is something where in plays and in like old theater and novels and even old cinema, it was literally like divine intervention, that something happens and angels rain down and save the heroes. And you're like, where the heck did that come from? In some ways, in the Lord of the Rings, the eagles are referred to sometimes as a Deus Ex Machina because, well, where were they this whole time? They seem to come out of nowhere. And I think there's stuff in the Silmarillion of why the eagles didn't just help them from the beginning. And like they had to earn it as people. But still, there's this weird thing in film where, well, that happening makes it so why didn't this happen before? These elements, like a literal Deus Ex Machina, is not this, because, and my thought on it is, magic exists here. Magic exists in this game state. So it is not a Deus Ex Machina to bring someone back to life, because magic exists. It also, you have souls, and the souls in this fantasy game go places. And I think this is why Dark Owls worked as a setup, because you're in hell. You're in another plane that's not our material world. So many adventures just happen in the material world. And when you start to branch your way out into the other realms, the other planes of existence, some of those planes are where souls go. And many souls go to those planes when they die. Like, they lived in the material realm, they go there. And you can talk to them. And they have, like, some of them are specters, some of them have like physical bodies. And this creates another opportunity inside this story. And because those other things exist, it could be that the soul passes and moves on somewhere else and like extends into an afterlife and they're gone, or they're bound to that plane and they can't leave, or they are sent and the soul is snatched and brought somewhere else. And I think back, I don't think this would happen, but if Solomon died, what if his soul was taken? It was on its way to a place of peace and it was taken by someone else. We go to resurrect him, we can't find his soul. Or we find it and it's trapped somewhere. So now we travel to that plane to get him back so he can be put to rest. It may not even be to get the character back. It's just so his ending can be, feel good. But I bring up, I get a little like twitchy, I think, at the term Ex Machina, because really there's a lot more narrative opportunities in this game, in the lore that's been set up with it and in the setting, than a standard novel or even a film, if you've established, and this is where I think it ties back to the very beginning of how we can treat death, at the very, very beginning, because if you've established this is possible, how death works, then you've opened the door to allow different interpretations of how you would be resurrected or how you could get back up from a blow. But if you haven't established those things, you might still have people at the table that are coming into this thinking this is like the real world. Sometimes people just die. And they might be there for that. And if you've established that as the setting and the tone, then you wouldn't have an Ex Machina, because that would feel like it cheapened that sudden experience if they've all bought into that. But if you've established at the beginning that there may be other things that happen, and there may be other deals you have to strike when you die, in order to get back up, if you want to, then it creates a different expectation. Because an Ex Machina is out of nowhere. But if you've established that there are certain things already in the world, then John's got a thing.
Yeah, because you're both right. So it's just you're coming at it from two different angles. So what Adam's talking about is purely narrative. And if you, like we've talked about, if you rely on pure narrative, a lot of times that can become a barrier to understanding what's actually happening. What Ian is saying is that there's a Deus Ex Machina mechanically, that there was no gameplay rule that was pre-established or pre-anything to explain why I resurrected his character. To give a little bit of background, Mu is a construct, and he died in the first round, or within the first combat, to a critical hit that dealt sneak attack damage. And because of that, there is an actual part where I had set up pre-established in the encounter, there would be a lightning elemental that would come through. And I'm like, I want to bring Mu back to life. The lightning elemental, as it passes through, has a bolt of lightning which reboots Mu's systems, and Mu comes back to life because of that. And honestly, that is a Deus Ex Machina mechanically. There's nothing in the mechanics that warrants me as the DM to allow this dead character to come back to life. And I just decided I wanted to, because I'm the DM and who's going to argue with me. And now, the other thing with the Deus Ex Machina narratively, usually Deus Ex Machina is when there is that divine intervention. There's this power that has not been pre-established, but then there is not an explanation or a satisfactory explanation afterward. So it's like, oh, we got saved, on to the next thing. So like, for example, in like Supernatural, to bring that back because we talked about that a few times, like Dean goes to hell, right? Spoiler alert. And then he gets risen out of nowhere. And you're just like sitting there like, well, that seems random. But narratively, from a writer's perspective, it introduced a greater cosmology that the next however many seasons would begin to explore. So now we've introduced angels as a character type. We've introduced the concepts of heaven in addition to hell, and the powers of angels. And, you know, what begins as a deus ex machina of how do we rewrite Dean back into the story after he died now becomes this narrative gateway to storytelling possibility. And I think that's the difference is this going to enrich the narrative, or is this a DM just kind of pulling something out to make a player feel better? Now, the one thing I will say to a deus ex machina potentially cheapening a pre-established experience where players expect to just die, this goes back to the Call of Cthulhu problem, where now the expectation might be that you don't take your characters seriously and you don't end up buying in. So you don't have a deus ex machina because no one's taking it seriously to begin with, and this entire conversation is moot, you know? So and I'm not saying every table that deals with death realistically is going to do that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying I've played a lot of TTRPGs. I have seen how systems directly affect player behavior from character creation to like at the table play, and that after you see enough patterns, you can start to infer certain things over time. You know, it's just kind of an experience and kind of a gut thing. So I would say for the deus ex machina thing, when do you use it? First, again, establish the expectations. If I know Ian put 3 hours into developing this deep backstory with a super cool arc for a character and it dies in the first combat, that is not narratively satisfying. That's not gameplay satisfying. So is it going to serve the experience better to just have him die and be killed because I rolled an @20 using the random number generator and roll 20? You know, is that going to be a more fun game because of that? Like I told, I was actually talking to a fellow DM last night. A lot of times, especially if you're on forums, you will see individuals harshly judge conversations like this without having actually experienced it. So, for example, when I prep my games, a lot of DMs would look at me and say, I am railroading, I have little player agency, and things will happen a certain way, and I'm like a control freak DM. I have asked every player that I've played with, and pretty much universally they've agreed, I feel like my choices aren't restricted, I feel more immersed than any other game you've ever played, and I feel like my choices are meaningful and matter. But if you look at my prep, it's literally like, all right, the players will start with this scene, then they'll go to this scene, then they'll go to this scene, and the game is done. So like if you can see the railroad, but it's the player choice isn't which encounters do they get to partake in. The choice is how do they choose to navigate this encounter, you know? And then how will those choices affect how they are introduced to and affect the next encounter, you know? If your first encounter is against goblins and you choose to talk to them and be friends with them, you might not have to fight goblins in the next encounter. But if the first thing you do is slaughter them and put their heads on pikes as an example for all goblin kind, you might have irritated the goblin tribes, you know? So there's a lot of player choice, but no matter what, the players are still going to go encounter 1, 2, 3. There's an encounter chain, you know? And I think that a lot of times, if you're looking for that immersion in that giving your players the ability to trust that they can be vulnerable in letting this character in their head, if suddenly you tear that character out, there's going to be a very real pain of getting that part of them, you know, they're going to feel that part of them die, and that can be a very rough thing. So it's more just, you know, again, you might have some players that are like, you know, we're 3 sessions in. I think that one of the things I want to do with my character is leave them dead, but their brother is going to come in, or their sibling is going to come in, and they're going to take up the mantle, and that's how we'll get a deeper narrative. You might have some other players that are like, I really like this character. Or you might have other players that say, I trust what you want to do as a DM. You know, like, I know that you're gonna serve us in our best interest, so I leave it to you, and I relinquish my control of my character's story. And this is nothing you can force. It is the ultimate expression of how much trust the players and DM have invested in each other.
I think the core of Dungeons & Dragons is puzzle and encounter design. I'll draw from favorite movies, video games, books, anything to create a one-of-a-kind play experience. When you start with a solid framework, all you need is to grab your best friends and hilarity ensues naturally. I'm Sully, Dungeon Master and host of the podcast How Friends Roll, a 5th edition actual play podcast of micro-campaigns featuring a rotating cast of characters. Come join our table. How Friends Roll is available wherever you get your podcasts.
In Grey Owls Book 1 and Campaign 1, our first PC death, and it was like a permadeath. It was a moment where we couldn't retrieve the body. We couldn't. They were taken by an enemy and like just killed right there. Boom, boom, and taken. And it was a very distinct shift in the tone so far. But the way I connected with that player, I got the impression from them that they were okay. And then it became very apparent they were not okay with that. And the way it happened, it was very sudden. We couldn't go back. It was a very distinct break of what was done. And it took a lot of time to kind of rebuild some of that rapport in creating a new character and trying to find something that would work better or work in a more satisfying way, feel more connected to the world. It was a very difficult line, and I still don't think it was handled well. I don't think it worked well. So it just means, okay, that's a terrible rep, and now we need to move forward and endeavor to make that a better relationship.
Yeah. As like a quick response to that, this is something my father would say. Sometimes, you know, we've said before, and I've said, like, you take a rep. The other way you can think of it is paying tuition. You know, I agree. I watched that interaction happen, Adam. You just paid a steep tuition, and now you're in a little bit of debt. But now you're paying it off. You know, that's the other way to think about it. Is when you mess up something like that. And also, I don't think you messed up that bad, right? But there was still that, you know, kind of thing that happened with the dynamic. You paid tuition, right? And it's like, oof, I messed up. Every time you take the responsibility of trying to like remedy that, you're now paying off your debt. That's another way to think of mistakes like that. And also, it doesn't mean that, you know, things aren't going to happen. But my question was, like, how would it have looked different if when that character got to 0 hit points and killed outright, you said, all right, your character mechanically has died. What happens next? And you said it that way. Now I'm just curious. I'm not necessarily saying you should do this. I'm just wondering how that would have played out. If they had said, you know, my character's neck gets snapped and the body gets taken away, that would be a very different thing than them saying, well, now I'm magically resurrected, which would also be a different thing to, you know, these are my character's last words. Now DM, you take control, which is also different than, you know, my character's body gets left behind so that they could be resurrected, you know? So it's one of those things where now when you give that player that kind of narrative control, it's also a test of trust. You as a player, as the DM, I'm going to trust you to best serve the narrative for everyone. How are you gonna best serve everyone with your character's untimely demise, you know? So it's more of a thought experiment, really, or a philosophical question than it is functional advice. I'm not saying DMs you should always do this. Especially, again, because if we look at our REST model, respect, empathy, satisfaction, trust, and rest, then then this is the end of the cycle. This is the test to see if ever you've done the first three enough. What's your investment going to look like on the other end of it, you know?
There's an interesting point here when it comes to not just the variables of the game. So there's the randomness of a character death. There is the story of a possible character death, like threats have come bearing down on you, and maybe your great rival comes and there's a clash and it doesn't end in your favor, and what do we do about that? And then there's the interesting train of logic and progression of a character making leaps of logic or difficult decisions, let's put it that way, the dumb decision model of I go off on my own, I sneak into the guard base, and then I stab a guard. Is that something there? I mean, there are consequences to those actions. We want to make sure there's a logical through line to those consequences. And if they get arrested or get shot with crossbow bolts and die in the guard station because they infiltrated a guard base that they weren't even trying to infiltrate, they went off on their own and did that thing, that would probably garner, I think, at this point, I think at the beginning of our DMings and even my DMings, I feel like this has happened, that someone has like gone off on their own and done something really dumb, and I have had them get knocked out, not killed them, but knocked them out, and then have them be like publicly put on like the stocks or something, and then the other party can go, what did you do? But I have then heard so many stories of people going off on their own and their character just died because they made a dumb decision. But then what was it about that thought train from the player that made them go do that? That what were they thinking? And I'm not asking it like, what were you thinking? I'm asking, no, what were you thinking? What was the train of logic here that probably made you think this was going to be okay? Or what was the desire that you wanted to do this with? There's a miscommunication from the expectations of the table and where what the player thought was appropriate. I feel like, yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to let Ian go right after me. As a DM, the only thing I would say that you could do is because we're talking about this was a major enemy and this player decided to go solo them, right? You as the DM, again, this is stepping out of character to make sure your players understand. You could die, bro. if you had said that, by the way, for story reasons, I get that your character would do this. I get everything going on narratively to let you know this might end up with you dead. If you start with that, now you're setting an expectation. And it's do you really want to do that? And almost the conversation we're talking about having after a player dies, you almost set it up before they make the decision, you know? And yes, it's kind of meta-gamey. And is not metagaming worth harming a real friendship? You know, Jeremy Crawford says no. I've seen the tweets where if some kind of mechanical ruling or the authenticity of the story is going to harm a real world relationship or dynamic, then it is not worth it. Because the point of the game is to have fun. So if the fun is going to be impeded for some kind of integrity, like narrative integrity, then to me that tuition is too high. But again, you don't know until you're there, you know? So you won't know it until you feel it. It's kind of like if your mom's like, don't touch the stove, it's hot. And she's like, don't touch the stove, it's hot. And you touch it. And that didn't feel good, did it? You go to touch it again? Like, sometimes you just got to experience that pain to empathize with it. That's what empathy is. I feel what you're feeling. I can't feel what you're feeling if I haven't felt it yet. I'm going to give it to Ian.
Yeah, I was just going to say something similar, which is that I feel these kinds of situations are a symptom of miscommunication and a kind of a drop of expectations at the table. When I say drop of expectations, I mean like your player had expectations about the game. You as the DM had expectations about the game, and they just didn't match up because maybe, well, sometimes expectations change too. So it's not like, you know, even if we talk about like doing all these things in advance, like talking about like what we expect from our players at the table at session 0, right? Like, this is what I expect from you guys. I expect you guys to be respectful, you know, empathetic. I respect you guys to, I expect you guys to not be jerks about it. My cat is talking to me. And I expect you guys to work within the rules of the game, you know, no metagaming and we've talked about metagaming and what metagaming actually is as opposed to like what useful metagaming is. Can you stop? I am trying to podcast. What? No, get out of here. And I can't pick her up. Like, if I could pick her up, this wouldn't be a problem because I could just pick her up and hold her. But you know, you set up your expectations at the table for how your players are going to behave, how you're going to behave when you're, as the DM, setting up these encounters, setting up social encounters, and you know, exploration and stuff. And this is all in advance to avoid this kind of hardship, avoid this kind of tension between actual living, breathing people. But sometimes it just doesn't work out, and so. Go away. I love you, but go away. And so when these expectations are subverted, that's what causes tension. This happens to me in video games all the time, especially MMOs or MOBAs. Like, you know, as a team of strangers trying to work together to make this game work and to pull out the win, when your teammates don't behave the way you expect them to, you get mad because, and like, this is a metacognitive approach, right? My in the moment approach is like, well, why would you do that? But metacognitively, they've subverted your expectations as a teammate. They haven't supported you the way that you need them to, or they haven't followed along in the way that you need them to for this to work out. And so when this kind of thing happens in D&D, it's important to take a step back. Sometimes you don't know what that's like until it happens. And then you learn that lesson and try to, you know, circumvent it in the future. I just wanted to mention before we get too far away from it that we were talking about Call of Cthulhu and how there are a lot of players out there who play Call of Cthulhu and they just play silly characters. And we were saying that's because they're not immersed. They haven't bought in to the setting. They haven't bought into their character possibly dying, and they don't want to. They don't think it's worth setting up the character for 3 to 6 to 9 hours, like me, in advance of the game, just to have them die. And another way to look at that psychologically is that silliness is a reaction to protect ourselves against emotional trauma. This is something that is like, it's a bit Psycho 101, It's not anything, super complicated, but it's something that we've heard a lot in some of our favorite anime, in some of the dubbed versions of our favorite anime, the abridged versions, like Hellsing Ultimate Abridged. Alucard is a very tragic character, but he's ridiculous. And the reason he's ridiculous is because he's so tragic. And then it's the same thing with Kirito in Sword Art Online Abridged. He's very silly, and he has a lot of boundaries to people because he's been hurt or he's afraid to get hurt. And the arc is exploring what happens when he gets hurt. So in Call of Cthulhu, I think that's a good thing to do, is that you preface the game with your character might die. This is linked to that whole expectations thing. You say it at the start, it's possible for your character to experience a sudden death. What do you guys think of that? Like, how do we want to play this? Do you want that possibility on the table where the dice just roll wrong and your character is stripped away from you? That hope is gone. It is extinguished. Are you here for that? Or do we want to make it a little bit, take it a little bit more gently? Do we not want to explore those feelings? Do we want to be silly about it? And that's okay too. I'm actually getting a little choked up about it because I keep thinking about Rowan. And the last time we talked about inferential world building and stuff, and how emotionally connected I realized I am to this character. I'm here for that. I'm here for Rowan's death. and that's because I want to feel that, because I haven't felt that for a character. Like, Eld died, but Eld came back in a really awesome way. But like, I feel like there's a lot more on the table for Rowan. It's a much more somber experience, whereas Eld is much more chaotic and contaminated by the Fae. I guess you could say corrupted. That's actually something I've been thinking about too. But anyways, yeah. that's what we say about the Fae, is they're contaminating.
And that's the thing too, though, is that, so D&D, this was the insight when Ian's like, what was that face? This is the face. Is that D&D is a collaborative storytelling experience, but it is not conducive to traditional storytelling. And what I mean by that is that you can have a membrane, but you cannot have a structure. That's going to be, that's like the terms I'm going to use now. I might think on it and like conflict with myself later. But what I mean by this is, like, if you look at a lot of traditional stories, there's a pluck element to characters, or, when a character dies, ideally it's to serve the narrative. And in D&D, sometimes your character dies not to serve the narrative, but just because you rolled wrong, right? And that's an additional storytelling element that isn't in traditional stories, right? So stories have a structure. Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. When you read the same story, it has the same beginning, middle, and end, unless it's a choose your own adventure book. But even then, the choices are set. Whereas in like a module, you could run the same module with 4 different parties and get 4 different, completely different stories, So what I'm saying here is that, and this, again, to bring it back to Brennan Lee Mulligan, seriously, you should go listen to his podcast. One of the things he said is that one time he had a new player and they were playing a paladin, and this is back in 3rd edition, I guess, when paladins were strength wisdom characters, and this player didn't do any strength or any wisdom. They put all of their stats in charisma. And the idea being is that they're a plucky adventurer and they just get lucky when things go right and they can talk their way out of situations. That same player was like not mechanically performing and not having fun with the character, because that's not what the game rewards. So whereas I could see some players being like, well, obviously, this is something going wrong, I can see something to bring it back to like Adam's example of this player being like, do you know what would be a great story? Because from my understanding, the enemy that killed this player was part of that player's backstory. So now it's like, this is my rival and I'm going to go toe to toe with him. That sounds like a great story. D&D mechanically does not reward that approach. So especially under knowing what character class that player was using and knowing what their loadout looked like because the mechanics don't offer that approach, now that's a time to abandon the mechanics if that's the storytelling thing they actually want to go for, you know? And now it starts to become, again, about the narrative, because either mechanics are impactful to your narrative or they're not. That's a decision that has to be made. And if they are, then you don't have the liberty of going, well, that's what the book says, so that's what we're going by. If you're going to be more narrative driven, right? If you're going to be more mechanical, just be upfront and be like, by the way, mechanically, you're not likely to make it out of here alive, you know? So the traditional storytelling approach is in a way incompatible with D&D because randomness is an inherent part of the game system. So I'm going to pass it off to Adam now.
Now, with a lot of what we're doing, we'll start with a certain framework for our discussion, but it is very integral to our entire REST model. When we're framing death, a lot of the arguments that I read about finally kind of sprung to me was, well, people are very obsessed with the idea of punishment. That in their mind, you know, dumb decisions or poor choices should be punished. That death, in a lot of ways, is a way that DMs will punish players for bringing a silly character to a serious game, or they'll kill the character to show them that that was not the character you should have made. Try again. And that comes from a very, I would consider, a deep, dark place of the legacy of D&D, where it's that adversarial relationship between the DM and the players. You didn't get it right this time, your character dies, now try again. When how much better served is it if we simply pause play and level with the player? Be like, you made this in this setting where I said these are the expectations, and then you made this, and you're going to clash with these expectations, and this could get really weird because you didn't make something that was immersed in the world. Or it's clear that what you're doing is bothering the other players. Let's talk about that. Let's have a discussion, we as people, so we can play together more effectively. What's up? And that's so much more effective in not just building a good game, but in building a good table where you're working with other human beings. And to see all these discussions where, oh, I'm having trouble with this kind of player, help me, Facebook brain, and to have 8 out of every 10 suggestions be just kill them is completely asinine. It breaks my heart. That's not how we're supposed to teach people. Like, why would you just do that? Have a discussion with the player. And of course, all of those situations, they're asking for advice, and we don't have the full context of that table. We don't know what certain things have been tried already. There's a lot more there. But I find it very strange and visceral that so many responses are just kill the player. Or I'm sorry, just kill the PC, not the player. Don't kill the person. But just kill the character and tell them to make another one. And it's, why not, maybe even if the outcome is that character goes away and we make a new one, maybe that comes from a conversation of, okay, this doesn't seem to align with the expectations. Can you walk me through what you were thinking or what kind of story you wanted to tell? And then we can meet in the middle. There's a lot more that can go there instead of treating death. And death doesn't have to be a punishment. It can be a narrative thing. And that's the other thing. DMs will wield death, or at least be encouraged to wield death, the killing of a character, as a punishment to discourage certain behaviors, when so much more of that could have preserved the character and just had a conversation.
I empathize with it a lot more, actually. I kind of get it. I don't agree with it. That doesn't mean I don't get it. Because a lot of people, and this was a stereotype, it's not a stereotype I agree with, and also I have noticed this at the table. A lot of players are attracted to TTRPGs because they get to be someone that they feel they're not in their real lives. So someone who's charismatic, someone who is in control, even though randomness is something we keep talking about, in D&D you're in very much more control of this imaginary space than a lot of people feel in their real lives. And it's why a lot of people are attracted to DMing, is because of that element of having control over the story. Finally, I have the power, and when we say have a conversation, it's the same thing with talking about death. This is a much more vulnerable place for the DM to be in. It relinquishes that control. That's a much scarier suggestion than just saying kill the PCs, So what's happening is you're not seeing people that are trying to be mean. You're seeing people that are trying to protect themselves, right? And a lot of times when you're operating out of fear, it unfortunately leads to a lot of suffering and a lot of different expressions, right? And honestly, talking it through is a lot harder and requires a lot more skill than just killing the PCs and saying start over, So, and again, a lot of what attracts people to D&D is that sense of control. We've seen the memes, we've made the jokes, What's the fantasy part of D&D? The fact that I can get up at 8 a.m. without any problem. And the fact that I can decide to just study for 4 hours to get better at something. Not actually have to put in the work, just be like, I studied this book. Now I'm better at sword, So, like, this idea, when you have to put in the real world emotions and you have to put your own sense of self on the table, part of, again, why, and this is a healthy thing about D&D, is that when you practice establishing the identity of a player character, you're also helping establish the identity of yourself. And a lot of times to be vulnerable with your real world identity is too much for people. So unfortunately, the way it manifests is through a mechanical thing that they can rely on, which is, oops, your character's not effective. The game told you so. So it's dead and make a new character, And again, obviously, I don't think that's a better way to do it, but I get it. I understand why that would be your default, and that's just people. This is another thing Brendan Lee Mulligan said. Depravity and cruelty is part of the human experience, and that's part of human nature, and that you're not a trash person if you feel those things. Acting on them, on the other hand, is a little bit more debatable. But the idea being that, that's just being part of human. So why don't we learn to healthily navigate that as opposed to trying to repress that, So, and that's why we have the empathy in rest, right? That's how you build trust, is through empathy. Again, feeling what somebody else is going through, which means acknowledging those parts of yourself that you honestly would rather not. Because it'd be easier that way. But once you do, what becomes possible, So, and it's one of those things, it's to come back to a martial arts thing. It's a lot of times more comforting to be a warrior enjoying a garden than a gardener in the middle of a war. So one of the reasons you develop power is in order to develop compassion. And a lot of times that means acknowledging parts of yourself you'd rather not acknowledge, but understanding that when you do, it empowers you to be able to be a kinder, more compassionate person. And I think that a lot of times we're set up in these antagonistic dichotomies, right? This is more John getting into politics, but we're set up in these antagonistic dichotomies that end up doing nobody real good, because it's all about blaming other people rather than what my teacher would say, which is holding up a mirror to your shadow side and really giving it a good look and really making firm decisions of how you're going to choose to act on it. Those are all very scary things. And that's a fear a lot of people would rather hide away from. But I invite you to take a deep gaze into the abyss, and who knows, maybe it'll gaze back.
in the side chat here, we were saying, like, it feels like we're not really just talking about death itself in the game. It's really a listener said it's more like a story of trust, and I agree. I think what we're talking about is like an aspect of the overarching story, something that needs to be addressed, but is not like, it's not like the story. Like, like the whole point of life isn't just death. The whole point of the game isn't just, oh, my character is going to die eventually, whatever. They maybe they did a cool thing in life, but death is the important thing, right? No, it's this is like, we're just addressing something that we feel needed to be explored more, based on how we addressed it last time. Yeah. Death is meaningful because life is meaningful. And so how do we bring that into the game? And that's really what we're trying to explore. Because, as we've been saying, D&D is therapeutic. It's not therapy, but it's therapeutic. It helps you explore things about yourself or about the world around you that maybe you can't do normally. Well, usually you shouldn't be able to do normally, I suppose, when it comes to death. But, one of the things that I've been wanting to do lately is kind of talk about the bullet points that I take away from our discussions, because I love what we talk about, but sometimes it's like I get like a sensation where it's like I have a general idea of what we talked about and I wrote notes, but if I don't go back and read those notes, some of the points get lost on me. So for listeners out there who enjoy bullet points, lists, basically highlights of what we're trying to take away from this, that's what I've written right now. So the first thing I have is that at session 0, and even at later sessions, expectations need to be established when concerning, well, everything, but in this case, especially death, character death, rather. You should all of you, including the players and the DMs, should be empathetic to the players at the table. And as the DM, it is your job to listen to how your players feel about PC death and what you can do about that. And that death is also not a punishment that should be wielded against the players. Now, like we said, sometimes just dumb things happen, or maybe a player doesn't know what the consequences would be for whatever their actions are. Like, oh, I see you're really attached to that player character there. Be a shame if something happened to it, because they don't realize that it's very much a real possibility that if you go into a guard compound of enemy guards that don't like you and know about you, and you try to pick a fight with one, you might die. Now, like we said, there are alternatives to that, which actually brings me to my next point, that there are alternative metrics for failure that are possible in D&D, like John said. Death might not be the end of every fight. As a martial artist, I can say that I'm not trying to kill somebody when I defend myself, unless I have to. But it's always that like last resort kind of thing, that you are not like I'm playing a character right now. He's a wizard. You can't do non-lethal damage with magic. So I try to look for alternatives when I feel that the situation calls for it, because I'm not trying to kill that little goblin, those two goblins who are trying to eat an owl because they're hungry and starving. And I don't what's going on here? We sense that this owl has magical effects cast upon it. Oh, maybe that's a significant owl. Okay, maybe then I do want to stop them from eating the owl before I find out what's going on there. And that's great. Yeah, okay. So we trick them, we knock them out, the melee people have their turn. And I, as the wizard, am not using magic missile to just annihilate these two goblins. So you can approach each encounter with a fresh perspective, I guess you could say. Is this a time where it's a fight to the death for my character? If not, well, remember, you have skills, you have role play that you can use to try and navigate these situations. And this bullet point, this upcoming one, is not for everyone. because it depends on what you're looking for at the table. Again, hearkening back to those expectations. If you're looking for deep storytelling, deep narratives, relinquishing control and being vulnerable leads to our greatest changes in life as people and as characters. This is a lesson also that some of you might recognize from Legend of Korra in the first book. At the end of the first book, there's a scenario where Korra, I'm not going to spoil it too much, but also you should have seen it by now. I'm not going to spoil it, but the lesson is when we find ourselves at our lowest point, we are open to the greatest change. And I think that's a great way to put it, because it's not saying that being vulnerable always leads to the greatest change, but it can if you let it, if you're open to that. My last bullet point, there's loads of things to take away from this discussion, but these are the ones that really spoke to me, which is just coming back to what I said earlier, is that D&D is therapeutic because of this. We can witness the things that our characters are going through. We can empathize with them, like I do with Rowan. I am very attached to that because I'm letting myself be attached. If I wanted to make a silly character and I didn't want to be emotionally compromised and I wanted to protect myself from that, I could just be silly. I could be tragic. I could have tragic stuff, but my character's perspective would be silly, like it was with Eld in the beginning. But that was also a little bit different because I like making people laugh. And so the final thing here is that D&D can help us healthily navigate ourselves and our lives to become better people, as we always say. We don't always say it, actually. Like, we say it at the start of the session, but a lot of the times our discussions don't end with us saying, tying it back into that we're navigating our best selves through gaming. Like, we talk about wonderful things, and I love these discussions. But sometimes I feel like it's good to repeat for our listeners out there that this is our goal, is to approach D&D from a unique philosophical perspective in the end that will help us become better people. And that's all I got on my little list. But yeah, thought I'd share that.
That was a really good conclusion, Ian. Well done.
Thanks. It always works out better when I write it down in advance.
It was heartfelt and good. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. If you would like early access to episodes, as well as some sneak peeks into some other projects we're working on, you should go check out our Patreon at patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. It also allows you to jump in and watch the recording process of our various episodes. It's really cool. A cool chat function. If you want to read our words and all of our other content, you should go check out our website at DM Shower Thoughts. And we'll put the links in the description down below. And if you want to make sure you don't miss anything that we're doing, you should go find us on our Facebook page and go find Dungeons & Dragons DM Shower Thoughts. This podcast uploads on Podbean and iTunes and Spotify every Friday at noon. And have a wonderful day, everybody. And please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.